morning.
I still regard the Russians as Europeans, so they may not have participated in what we in the West call the three great events of Western civilization, the Reformation, the Renaissance, and the Enlightenment. Nevertheless, they are Europeans. They speak an Indo-European language, and their culture is not that alien to us, contrary to popular belief. So what is Europe? And I think what happens is that everyone in Berlin who looks east has a view of the world that is not very different from the people in Berlin in 1900 who looked east. And the people in Paris who look south, east, west, north, their view of the world isn't very different from what it used to be. Now, that doesn't mean that no one has changed and people are unreconstructed Neanderthals. No, I'm simply being honest about what's important in each of these countries, what leads them to cooperate or fight. I think the Europeans have to look at themselves objectively and decide where is the commonality of interest and culture that supports a true security zone. Because frankly, if you think the Italians, the Spaniards, the Portuguese, the Greeks, or even the French for that matter, are remotely interested in fighting a war in Ukraine, you've lost your mind. No one there is interested. It's not going to happen. And frankly speaking, to most of them, whatever happens in that part of the world is irrelevant to them. This is not a new problem. You know, during the Versailles Treaty discussions, when they were trying to put together new solutions, if you will, all of which turned out to be disastrous for, post-war Europe, no one involved in these discussions knew anything about the world really much beyond Berlin and Vienna. Everything that happened in Budapest, Prague, Warsaw, and these other places was a mystery. And they made bad decisions that came back to haunt us horribly. So I don't think that you can compel unanimity of interest on the basis of an artificial construct called the European Union. The same is true for NATO. I mean, remember, people used to talk all the time about NATO's real mission is to keep the Soviets out and the Germans down and all this nonsense. Well, that all went away. It's all irrelevant now. We didn't try to put anything in its place, but we also didn't try to induce anyone in Europe to think about an alternative. You know, one of the first things that I believed very strongly when I came back from Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe in 2000 was that the military commander, the supreme commander of Allied Powers Europe, should not be an American, should be a European. Now, if the Europeans want to rotate that, that's fine. Do whatever they want. But it was time for us to get out of the business of dominating Europe militarily. The problem was that when you sat down with the Europeans and said, well, if you're going to operate effectively, you need to build your own command, control, communications, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance complex. In other words, you have to have the space-based capabilities and all this sort of thing. Everybody's eyes glowed over. So, well, the Americans bring that. And I said, well, as long as the Americans are bringing that, you're going to end up under their command and control. Now, we've done everything in our power, let's be frank, to drag Europe into a war against Russia. This did not begin in February of 2022. We've been doing this for years. We started decisively in 2014 when we destabilized Ukraine, replaced the government. We launched a coup, all backed by the CIA, and installed essentially a regime in Kiev that was prepared to be hostile to Russia and carry out our interests. So, is this the future Europeans want? And now you have this ruling elite, if you will, governing all of your countries, telling you that this is wonderful, that everyone should go to war with Russia, and depicting Russia as though it were still a Soviet state under Stalin, which is absurd. None of that's true. Now, some people say, well, the Russian human rights record isn't this or that. I've got news for you. You can point to many, many flaws in everybody's society in every country. The United States is hardly invulnerable to that sort of criticism. We've all got problems internally with all sorts of things. That doesn't justify a war with anybody, especially since the Russians haven't taken any action that is fundamentally anti-European. On the contrary, you've had the Russians bending over backwards ever since the Cold War, which was really a hot war going on in Ukraine for years. When that finally blew up in everyone's faces, the Russian government is still bent over backwards to avoid conflict with Europe. Doesn't want it, wants to do business. I just, it's astonishing to me that this never finds its way into the mainstream media. And if I were a European and I listened to the dialogue over there and listened to what comes out of Washington, I'd be scared to death. First question I'd have is, why should we in the Netherlands, why should any reasonably intelligent Dutchman want to go to war in eastern Ukraine? Over what? For what?
Yeah, the main reason they are now trying to sell is that if we don't do anything about what's going on in Ukraine, then the Baltics will be next. With the first casualty would be Lithuania, because then Putin would try to establish a land bridge between Russia and Kaliningrad. How would you assess that threat? Is there any truth to that claim, or?
No, not at all. But the longer we sustain this hostility and pursue conflict Russia, the more the Russians will feel compelled to defend themselves and take actions that they think are prudent. So that means any number of different things. We can't undo right now the disaster of Kaliningrad, turning Königsberg, which for 1,000 years was a German-speaking city in a largely German-dominated area, over to Stalin, which was done basically on the basis of a short note between Stalin and FDR as FDR was dying. And Stalin said, "Oh, well, you wouldn't mind, would you, if we just kept Königsberg? We'd like to have the port. Is that a problem?" And FDR said, "Oh, of course not. Well, by all means, have at it." These are how decisions are made, sadly, when the wrong people are in power who know nothing. So we're still struggling with that. But having said all of that, no, I don't see any evidence that the Russians want this. I mean, first of all, war, contrary to popular belief, is not a good business opportunity. It's deranged. And I think Europeans in general have figured that out. At least I thought they had. So the idea of a war on the European continent, which was for years anathema to everyone, has now suddenly become acceptable. Again, I think the Europeans need to look at this thing more objectively and start asking what is in their interest. Do they have any interest? I mean, the same people telling you in the Netherlands that you should be prepared to fight the evil Russians who aren't coming are also trying to destroy your farmland, your agrarian sector. I mean, the Netherlands is probably, if not the most productive agricultural system in the world, then it's pretty damn close. Yet you seem to be bent on destroying it. I mean, this is like the Germans who have said, no, we don't want real energy, so we're going to destroy our scientific industrial base, which is the foundation for much of Europe's prosperity and their own, in favor of turning ourselves into an agrarian wasteland. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. The world is turned upside down. People need to start looking at this nonsense and asking hard questions.